The first time I noticed the account, it only had one follower. That probably sounds like a strange detail to remember, but it stood out because the account was following me. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was 26, living alone in a small apartment outside Pittsburgh, and working remotely for a software company. Most of my days were predictable. I woke up around 7, made coffee, logged into work, and spent the day staring at spreadsheets and project tickets. Nothing exciting ever happened. That's probably why I remember the account so clearly. The username was just a random combination of letters and numbers. No profile picture, no posts, one follower, following only me. I assumed it was a bot. I removed it and forgot about it. A few days later, another account followed me. Different username, same blank profile, same lack of posts, same single follower. Again, it was only following me. I removed that one too. By the third account, I started paying attention. I remember sitting at my desk during lunch and opening Instagram. The new account had followed me less than 10 minutes earlier. No posts, no bio, no profile picture, one follower, following one person, me. I clicked around trying to figure out whether it was some kind of spam network, maybe fake accounts automatically generated by bots. Then I noticed something strange. The account's follower was another blank account. When I clicked that one, it was following only the newer account, like they were connected. It felt odd, but not alarming. At least not yet. I told myself there were millions of fake profiles online. People create weird accounts every day. I removed it and moved on. The problem was that the accounts kept appearing. Not every day, not even every week. Sometimes 2 weeks would pass, then another one would follow me. Each account looked almost identical. No photos, no information, one follower, following only me. Eventually I stopped removing them. I figured it wasn't worth the effort. Nothing else unusual happened for months. Life continued normally. Work, gym, groceries, sleep. The accounts remained in the background like a minor annoyance. Then I started dating someone named Emily. We met through mutual friends. She worked as a nurse at a hospital nearby and was probably the most grounded person I'd ever met. The relationship moved slowly. Neither of us were interested in rushing into anything. By the time we'd been together about 4 months, she was spending most weekends at my apartment. Things felt good, normal. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building a future with someone. That's when the messages started. The first one arrived at 2:13 in the morning. I was asleep when it came in. When I woke up, I found a request sitting in Instagram messages. The account had no profile picture, no posts. The message contained only 4 words. She's not telling you. That was it. No explanation, no follow-up, nothing. I showed Emily that night while we were eating dinner. She laughed. Some scammer probably wants attention. I agreed. The message was creepy, but not enough to take seriously. I blocked the account. 3 days later, another account messaged me. This one said, "You should ask her." That was all. Again, blank profile. Again, no posts. Again, one follower. The same pattern. I blocked it. The third message came a week later. This time the account sent a photograph. It was a picture of Emily walking into the hospital parking garage. The image looked recent. Very recent. My stomach dropped immediately. I zoomed in. There was no question that it was her. Same jacket, same backpack, same car visible in the corner of the frame. The message underneath said, "Ask where she was after work." I stared at the screen for several minutes. This wasn't a bot. Someone was taking photographs of my girlfriend. Someone who clearly knew where she worked. That night, I showed her. For the first time since this started, she looked concerned. Not terrified, just confused. She insisted she had no idea who could be doing it. No ex-boyfriends, no problems at work, no stalkers, nothing. We reported the account. Instagram removed it. A week passed. Then another message arrived. This one included a photo of my apartment building, taken from across the street. The angle suggested whoever took it had been sitting in a parked vehicle. The message said, "You're easier to watch than she is." I remember reading that sentence 3 or 4 times. Not because it was threatening, because it sounded casual, like a conversation, like whoever wrote it thought we already knew each other. I barely slept that night. For the first time, I checked my windows before bed. I started looking outside whenever a car sat parked too long. I found myself paying attention to strangers, watching people who normally wouldn't deserve a second glance. Emily thought I was becoming obsessed. Maybe she was right, but the messages kept coming. Every account was different. Every account disappeared after sending 1 or 2 messages. There was never enough information for police to do anything useful. The messages also never became directly threatening, just unsettling, as if someone wanted us to know they were there. One Friday evening, things got worse. Emily was staying over. We ordered takeout and spent most of the night watching movies. Around 11, she fell asleep on the couch. I got up to lock the balcony door before heading to bed. That's when I noticed something. Across the parking lot, a vehicle, dark-colored SUV, engine off, lights off, just sitting there. At first I thought nothing of it. Then I realized it was facing directly toward my building. I watched for several minutes. Nothing happened. No one got out. No lights turned on. The vehicle remained completely still. Eventually, I went to bed. The next morning it was gone. I didn't mention it to Emily. I knew how paranoid I already sounded. The following week, I saw the SUV again. Same parking lot, different spot. Again facing my building. Again sitting motionless. I told myself it was probably a resident, but something felt wrong. The next night, I drove around the complex after work. I wanted to see if the SUV belonged to someone. Maybe if I found which unit it parked near, I could stop worrying. Instead, the SUV wasn't there. I felt ridiculous, like I was creating problems that didn't exist. Then Saturday happened. Emily and I spent most of the afternoon downtown. Lunch, shopping, normal couple stuff. Around 4 o'clock, we stopped at a bookstore. While Emily was browsing, I went upstairs to the used book section. I remember reaching for a novel when I noticed a man standing at the opposite end of the aisle. He wasn't doing anything unusual. He wasn't staring. He wasn't following me. But something about him felt familiar. Tall, gray hoodie, baseball cap, average in every possible way. I couldn't place why I recognized him. Then I realized I'd seen him before. In the parking lot of my apartment complex. Standing near the dark SUV. Not once, twice. The moment I recognized him, he turned and walked away. I followed, not because I thought he was dangerous, because I wanted confirmation. I wanted to know if I was imagining things. I reached the end of the aisle. The man was already gone. I checked downstairs. Nothing. Outside. Nothing. No sign of him anywhere. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, another message arrived. New account. Same format. 1 follower. Following only me. The message contained a single sentence. You're finally paying attention. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I looked over at Emily sleeping beside me. And for the first time since this started, I had a feeling that none of this was random. Someone wasn't just watching us. Someone wanted me to know they were watching us. And deep down, I had the unsettling feeling that whatever this person wanted, they were only getting started. I didn't tell Emily about the message right away. Part of me didn't want to worry her, but if I'm being honest, another part of me was starting to wonder if somehow she knew more than she was telling me. Not because I distrusted her. The messages were simply designed to make me question things. Every message seemed carefully crafted to create doubt without actually saying anything concrete. She's not telling you. Ask where she was after work. You should ask her. None of those messages contained proof of anything. They only planted ideas. The worst part was that they were working. For the next week, I found myself noticing little things that never would have bothered me before. If Emily took longer than usual to answer a text, I noticed. If she got a phone call and stepped into another room, I noticed. If she seemed distracted, I noticed. I hated it. I knew exactly what was happening. Some stranger had managed to insert themselves into our relationship without ever speaking directly to either of us. The messages weren't trying to reveal information. They were trying to create suspicion. One evening, Emily finally confronted me. We were sitting in my apartment eating dinner when she put her fork down. What's wrong with you lately? I looked up. What do you mean? You keep staring at your phone. I laughed awkwardly. I don't. You do. I didn't answer. She looked at me for several seconds. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you think those messages are true? The room suddenly felt very quiet. No, she nodded slowly. but I could tell she wasn't convinced. Neither of us said much after that. The conversation ended there, but something had changed. The messages were affecting both of us now. The next incident happened 3 nights later. I woke up around 3 in the morning needing water. The apartment was dark except for a small light coming from the kitchen. As I walked toward it, I glanced through the living room window and froze. The SUV was back. This time it wasn't across the parking lot. It was directly outside my building, close enough that I could clearly see the windshield. I stood there watching. Nothing moved. The vehicle looked empty. Still, something felt wrong. I grabbed my phone and stepped onto the balcony. The moment I opened the door, the SUV's headlights turned on. My heart nearly stopped. A second later, the engine started. The vehicle pulled away and exited the complex. I never saw who was inside. The timing couldn't have been a coincidence. Whoever it was had been watching the building, waiting. The next morning, I finally contacted the police. I knew there probably wasn't much they could do, but I wanted a report on file. The officer I spoke with was polite. Unfortunately, he told me exactly what I expected to hear. No threats, no property damage, no evidence of a crime. The accounts kept disappearing before investigators could do much. The SUV description wasn't enough. Basically, unless the person escalated, there wasn't much anyone could do. That answer didn't make me feel better. A few days later, things escalated. I arrived home from work and found an envelope wedged beneath my apartment door. No stamp, no address, no return information, just a plain white envelope. I remember immediately feeling sick because I already knew who it was from. Inside was a photograph. Nothing else. No note, no message, just a photo. It showed Emily sitting inside a coffee shop, across from another man. At first glance, it looked terrible. The photo appeared intimate, personal. Exactly the type of image that would trigger every insecurity the messages had been building. Then I looked closer. The man looked familiar, very familiar. After several seconds, I realized why. He was wearing hospital scrubs. The logo on his uniform matched the hospital where Emily worked. The photo wasn't evidence of cheating. It was evidence that somebody had followed her to lunch with a coworker. That realization disturbed me even more. The person behind this wasn't gathering information. They were manufacturing doubt, trying to push me toward a conclusion. That night, I showed Emily. Instead of arguing, she immediately called the coworker. The two of them had been discussing a patient transfer during their lunch break. Nothing more, exactly as she claimed. For some reason, that made me feel relieved, but also created a new question. Why would someone go through all this effort? What was the goal? The answer came sooner than I expected. 3 nights later, I received another message. New account. Same pattern. One sentence. She isn't the reason. I stared at it. Then another message appeared. The reason is you. For the first time, the messages didn't mention Emily. For the first time, the focus shifted directly toward me. I spent the next hour reading every previous message, every photo, every account, looking for something I'd missed. And eventually I found it. Not in the messages, in the photographs. Every image contained a date. The metadata remained attached. I had never bothered checking. When I compared the timestamps, a strange pattern emerged. Every photo had been taken near places I regularly visited. My apartment, my gym, my grocery store, my office building, even a bookstore. Whoever this person was, they weren't primarily following Emily. They were following me. Emily had simply been included because she was close to me. The realization made my skin crawl. The next day I took off work. I drove around town retracing places I'd recently visited. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Then, while leaving a shopping plaza, I spotted it. The SUV, parked near the far end of the lot. My heart started racing. For a moment, I considered driving away. Instead, I parked several rows over and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, a man exited a nearby store and walked toward the SUV. Gray hoodie, baseball cap, the same man from the bookstore. Without thinking, I got out of my car. I started following him. The moment he noticed me, he froze. We stared at each other across the parking lot. Then he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a surprised smile. A smile that suggested he'd expected this. Then he got into the SUV and drove away. I managed to photograph the license plate. For the first time, I felt like I finally had something useful. The police traced the registration later that day. The result surprised everyone. The vehicle belonged to a private investigation company, not some criminal organization, not some stalker using fake plates, an actual licensed investigator. At first, I thought there had to be a mistake. Then investigators contacted the company, and everything finally made sense, or at least as much sense as it ever would. The private investigator had been hired months earlier by someone I'd completely forgotten about. An ex-girlfriend, not a recent one. Someone I had dated briefly nearly 3 years earlier. According to the investigator, she believed I had stolen money from her before the relationship ended. I hadn't. The accusation was ridiculous. Apparently, she became obsessed with proving it. When normal methods failed, she hired an investigator. The investigator spent weeks following me. Eventually, he concluded there was no evidence whatsoever. No theft, no crime, nothing. He submitted his report and ended the contract. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because someone else had access to those surveillance photographs. The investigator's son, a man in his early 20s who occasionally helped organize files for the company. He became fascinated with the case. At least that's what police later told me. Instead of deleting the materials after the investigation ended, he copied them. He created dozens of fake accounts, collected photographs, tracked my routines, and slowly built this bizarre fantasy around my life. The messages weren't part of an extortion attempt. They weren't revenge. They weren't even personal. The man had become obsessed with observing people, specifically me. The police eventually found hundreds of photographs on his computer, not just of me, other people too, people he'd never even spoken to, people whose lives he'd watched from a distance. Thankfully, he never attempted physical contact, at least not according to investigators. Still, that wasn't much comfort, because it meant that for nearly a year, someone had been studying my life without me knowing. The criminal charges that followed were complicated and honestly beyond my understanding. The man never directly threatened me. Most of the violations centered around harassment and unlawful surveillance. What mattered most was that it finally stopped. No more accounts, no more messages, no more photographs, no more SUV. Life gradually returned to normal. Emily and I stayed together. In fact, we're engaged now. Sometimes we still talk about those months, mostly because of how effective the messages were. Not because they revealed secrets, because they exploited uncertainty. A stranger didn't need evidence to create doubt. He only needed a few carefully chosen words. That's the part that still bothers me. Not the photos, not the surveillance, not even the thought of someone watching me. It's how close I came to believing a complete stranger over someone I loved. And if that final message had never arrived, if I never realized the focus was actually me, I honestly don't know how much damage those messages could have caused. The person behind the accounts never touched my life directly. Yet for months, he controlled how I viewed it. That's something I've never completely forgotten. The voicemail wasn't strange the first time I heard it. It became strange the fifth time. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly how it happened. The message sat in my inbox for almost 2 weeks before I paid attention to it. At the time, I was 31 and working as a property manager for several apartment complexes outside Columbus. Most of my job involved maintenance requests, tenant complaints, lease renewals, and occasionally dealing with people who were being evicted. It wasn't exciting work, but it paid well. The voicemail came in on a Thursday afternoon while I was showing an apartment to a potential renter. The caller didn't leave a name. The message lasted less than 10 seconds. All it contained was a man's voice saying, "Wrong number. Saw the..." That was it. No background noise. No explanation. Just 4 words. I listened to it once, shrugged, and deleted it. Or at least I thought I deleted it. The following week, I noticed it again. Same voicemail. Same timestamp. Same message. At first, I assumed my phone had glitched. I listened to it. Wrong number. Saw the... Then I deleted it again. A few days later, it reappeared. This time I knew something was off. I checked the phone number. Unknown caller. No record. No contact information. Nothing. I listened again. Wrong number. Saw the voice sounded calm, almost bored, like someone leaving a routine message. I deleted it for the third time. The next morning it was back. At that point, I stopped trying to delete it. Instead, I saved it. I figured maybe something weird was happening with my phone provider. It wasn't important enough to spend hours dealing with customer support. Life moved on. Then things started getting stranger. One night, after work, I was listening to music while cleaning my apartment. For some reason, I remembered the voicemail. I opened it again and hit play. Wrong number. Saw the... But this time I noticed something. There was another sound. Very faint, barely audible. A second voice. I replayed the message. Then again, and again. Eventually I connected headphones and turned the volume all the way up. The second voice was definitely there. I couldn't make out the words. Only a faint mumbling in the background. The discovery bothered me far more than it should have. The message suddenly felt different. Less accidental. More deliberate. I spent nearly 20 minutes replaying it, trying to understand what the second voice was saying. I never could. The next day, I forgot about it. At least until lunch. I was sitting in my truck eating a sandwich when my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally I wouldn't answer. Something told me to pick up. Hello. Silence. I checked the screen. The call was still connected. Hello. Nothing. Then a click. The line disconnected. A minute later, I received another voicemail. My stomach tightened immediately. The message was 6 seconds long. Same male voice. Same calm tone. Wrong number. I remember sitting there in my truck staring at my phone. I had no explanation. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even particularly weird. It's something about receiving the exact same voicemail twice unsettled me. That evening I played both messages side by side. The voice sounded identical. The wording was identical. Everything matched perfectly, except one thing. The second background voice sounded slightly clearer. Not clear enough to understand, just clearer. Almost like it was getting closer. I wish I could say I contacted someone right away. I didn't. I convinced myself it was a prank. Maybe someone from work messing with me. Maybe a friend. Maybe some weird automated robocall system. Anything felt more reasonable than what my imagination was suggesting. Over the next month, the voicemails continued. Always from unknown numbers. Always containing the same 4 words. Always with that faint second voice. The messages arrived randomly. Sometimes 3 days apart. Sometimes a week apart. There was never a pattern. The only consistent thing was that each new voicemail made the background voice slightly easier to hear. I became obsessed. Every new message meant another opportunity to figure out what the second voice was saying. I downloaded audio software. I watched tutorials online. I even posted anonymously on a forum asking for help enhancing audio recordings. Nobody could make out the words. One person suggested it sounded like a television in another room. Another thought it might be a police scanner. A third said it sounded like someone whispering. None of the answers felt right. Then one Friday night, everything changed. I was sitting in my apartment watching a baseball game when a voicemail notification appeared. I hadn't received a call, just a voicemail. That was unusual by itself. When I played it, the familiar voice returned. Wrong number. Then after a pause, something happened. For the first time, the second voice became understandable. Not completely, just one word. A name. My name. I nearly dropped the phone. I replayed it immediately. The background voice whispered, "Daniel." I sat frozen on my couch. My heart was pounding. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe after weeks of obsessing over these messages, my brain was hearing things that weren't there. I listened again and again. Every time I heard it, Daniel. There was no mistake. Someone in the background had spoken my name. I barely slept that night. The next morning I called my sister. She listened to the recording. I intentionally didn't tell her what I thought I'd heard. Afterward, I asked what she heard. Her answer made my stomach drop. It sounded like someone saying her name. That was all the confirmation I needed. For the first time, I became genuinely concerned. The messages weren't random. Whoever was leaving them knew who I was. The following week, I finally contacted the police. The officer I spoke with was polite, but clearly unimpressed. Unknown calls. No threats. No demands. No criminal behavior. There wasn't much they could do. I understood. Honestly, I probably would have reacted the same way. The messages were creepy, but creepy isn't always illegal. Life became uncomfortable after that. Every unknown call made me anxious. Every voicemail notification caused my stomach to tighten. I found myself checking locks before bed, looking out windows, paying attention to parked cars. Nothing obvious ever appeared. No stalke, no suspicious neighbors, no strange encounters, only the voicemails. Then came the message that changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday night. I was brushing my teeth before bed when the notification appeared. Another voicemail. I already knew what I would hear. Wrong number. I pressed play. The familiar voice spoke. The familiar pause followed. Then the second voice whispered something clearly enough that I finally understood an entire sentence. I felt the blood drain from my face. Because the whisper said, "He's in the apartment." I must have listened to it 20 times. The words never changed. The message was unmistakable. "He's in the apartment." I immediately searched every room. Closets, bathroom, laundry room, under the bed, everywhere. Nobody was there. The apartment was empty. I checked the locks twice, then 3 times. Nothing appeared disturbed. No signs of entry. No evidence whatsoever. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling. Because if the whisper wasn't referring to someone in the apartment, then who exactly was it talking about? And why did it sound like a warning? I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little sound made me sit upright in bed. The hum of the refrigerator, the air conditioning turning on, a car passing outside. Normally I would have ignored all of it. Instead, I found myself listening to every noise as if it might reveal something. Around 4 in the morning, I finally gave up on sleeping and made coffee. The apartment felt different. Not physically different, psychologically different. The moment that voicemail said, "He's in the apartment," my home stopped feeling completely safe. I kept telling myself it was ridiculous. Someone had whispered a vague sentence in a voicemail. That was all. There was no evidence of anything. No signs of break-in. No missing property. Nothing. Yet the feeling remained. The next morning I called out sick from work. I spent nearly the entire day going through every voicemail again. There were 16 in total. 16 versions of the same message. 16 recordings of strangers saying, "Wrong number. I started arranging them chronologically, listening carefully, comparing each recording. That's when I noticed something I'd completely missed. The background voice wasn't getting louder. It was getting closer. At first, the whisper sounded distant, like someone speaking from another room. Later recordings sounded much nearer, almost beside the caller. And the final voicemail, the one from the night before, made it sound as though the whisperer was standing directly next to him. That realization bothered me more than anything else. It suggested there were 2 people involved, one leaving the message, another speaking in the background. But why? None of it made sense. Late that afternoon, I decided to stop obsessing over audio files and leave the apartment. I drove across town to clear my head, grabbed food, walked around a bookstore, tried to convince myself I was blowing everything out of proportion. For a while it worked. Then I got home. Something immediately felt wrong. The moment I stepped inside my apartment, I noticed a chair in my kitchen. At first glance, it looked normal. Then I realized it wasn't. I always kept the chair pushed beneath the table. Now it was pulled out, only slightly, maybe 6 inches, the kind of thing most people would never notice. But I noticed, because I lived alone, and because I'd spent the previous night terrified that someone might be inside my apartment. I stood there staring at the chair. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd forgotten to push it in. That explanation was far more reasonable than the alternative. Still, I checked every room again. Nobody. Nothing. The following week became the worst week of my life. The voicemails accelerated. Instead of one every few days, they arrived daily. Then multiple times per day. The message never changed. Wrong number. But the whispers did. Small fragments. Short sentences. Bits of information. The first said, "He's watching." The second said, "Don't answer." Then, not much longer, every whisper sounded frightened. Urgent. Like someone trying to communicate secretly without being noticed. I started recording everything, saving every voicemail, documenting dates and times. Even the police officer who'd originally dismissed my concerns admitted the messages had become unusual. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to identify anyone. The calls originated from different disposable numbers. Every trail ended immediately, and something happened that completely changed the situation. I received a package. No return address. No sender information. Just a small brown box left outside my apartment door. I almost didn't open it. A part of me thought I should call the police first. Instead, curiosity won. Inside was an old cassette tape. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Just a cassette. I stared at it for several minutes. I didn't even own a cassette player. Eventually, I drove to a thrift store and bought one. The entire drive home, I debated whether I was making a mistake. Maybe opening the package was already a mistake. Maybe playing the tape would be another. But I needed answers. That evening, I inserted the cassette. At first, all I heard was static. Then voices. Two men. One voice was instantly recognizable. The voicemail voice. The man who always said, "Wrong number." The second voice sounded familiar too. Not because I'd heard it clearly before. Because it was the whisper voice. The one from the background. For nearly 10 minutes, I listened to a conversation between them. Neither man used names. Neither explained who they were. The recording sounded old. Years old. But one section made my blood run cold. The whisper voice said, "What happens if he finds out?" The other man laughed. Then replied, "He won't." A pause followed. Then, "He's too young to remember." I rewound that section repeatedly. Too young to remember. What did that mean? Who were they talking about? The answer arrived the next day, and it came from my mother. I drove to visit her after work. I hadn't planned on mentioning any of this, but eventually I told her everything. The voicemails, the whispers, the cassette tape. The moment I mentioned the tape, her expression changed. Completely. She looked pale, shocked, almost frightened. I immediately noticed. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. Instead, she asked, "What exactly did the voices say?" I repeated the conversation. When I finished, she stared at the kitchen table for several seconds. Then she said something that changed everything. There was another man. I remember feeling confused. "What?" She took a deep breath, then told me a story I'd never heard before. When I was 3 years old, my father disappeared. Not my biological father. The man who raised me. The man I believed was my father my entire life. According to my mother, he wasn't actually my biological parent. She'd been involved with two men around the same time. One became my father. The other became obsessed. When she chose one relationship over the other, the rejected man refused to accept it. For years he harassed them, showed up unexpectedly, called constantly, followed them. Eventually things became serious enough that police became involved. Then one day he vanished. Completely. No more calls. No more harassment. Nothing. My parents assumed he'd finally moved on, until my biological father disappeared. Officially, the case remained unsolved. No body, no arrest, no answers, just gone. I sat there speechless. My mother had never told me any of this. Not once. She said she wanted me to have a normal childhood, to grow up without carrying the history. Unfortunately, history had apparently found me anyway. That night, I gave the cassette tape to police. What happened afterward moved surprisingly fast. Investigators traced the tape to a storage unit rented under a false name. Inside, they discovered boxes of recordings, photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, decades worth of material. The unit belonged to the man from my mother's past, the man who'd become obsessed with her, the same man suspected of involvement in my father's disappearance. By then he was elderly, living alone several states away. When police finally located him, they found something disturbing. Hundreds of recordings, many involving my family, including recent recordings. Recordings of me. The voicemails weren't random. They weren't pranks. The man had been monitoring my family for decades. The whispers came from recordings he'd made years earlier with an accomplice who died long ago. The cassette had been assembled from fragments of those recordings. Investigators believe he mailed it accidentally while trying to send it elsewhere. The voicemails themselves appeared to be intentional. a twisted attempt to make contact, or perhaps to scare me. Nobody ever fully explained his motivation. Maybe there wasn't one. The case reopened several investigations, including my father's disappearance. Unfortunately, no definitive answers were ever found. The man died before any meaningful prosecution could occur. Even now, years later, I still think about those voicemails. Not because of the messages themselves, but because of what they revealed. My entire life, I believed my father's disappearance was simply a tragic mystery. Then a voicemail saying, "Wrong number. Sorry," uncovered a secret that had been buried for nearly 30 years. The strangest part is that I still have the recordings. Every once in a while, curiosity gets the better of me. I'll listen to one again. The voice always sounds the same. Calm, casual, almost forgettable. Wrong number. Saw the... But now I know it was never a wrong number. The calls were always meant for me, and that realization still keeps me awake some nights. The first time I noticed the apartment across the street, I thought the person living there was just lonely. I didn't think they were watching me. I didn't think there was anything strange about it. Looking back now, I realized there were small signs almost immediately, but I kept finding reasons to explain them away because the alternative was too uncomfortable to accept. At the time, I was 29 years old and had just moved into a small apartment complex after getting a new job in a different city. It wasn't anything fancy. The building was older, the parking lot was usually half empty, and most of the tenants kept to themselves. Honestly, that was exactly what I wanted. I had spent the previous few years living with roommates, and while I didn't hate it, I was ready to have my own space. I wanted somewhere quiet where I could come home after work, make dinner, watch something on my laptop, and not have to worry about anyone else. The apartment itself was on the third floor, facing another building that was almost identical to mine. The two buildings were separated by a small parking lot and some patches of grass. So from my living room window, I had a clear view of several apartments across the way. I never really paid attention to the people living there. I might see someone walking to their car or bringing groceries inside, but everyone seemed to have the same mindset. Get home, close the door, and mind your own business. That changed about 2 weeks after I moved in. One evening, I was sitting on my couch eating dinner when I noticed a light on in one of the apartments across from mine. Nothing unusual about that. People have lights on at night, but for some reason, I noticed that someone was standing near the window. It was just a silhouette at first. I couldn't make out any details because the room behind them was dark, and the reflection on the glass made it difficult to see anything clearly. I assumed they were probably just looking outside. Maybe they were on the phone. Maybe they were bored. I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, I got up to throw away my dinner container, and when I walked back into the living room, the person was still standing there. That was the first thing that felt slightly strange. They hadn't moved. I stood there for a second looking at the window, and then I noticed something else. They weren't looking outside. They were looking directly at my apartment. I immediately felt uncomfortable, but I also felt ridiculous for thinking that. The distance between the buildings wasn't that close, but it wasn't far either. Maybe they were just looking in my direction. Maybe their television was on behind them, and they were actually focused on something else. I turned off my living room light and walked away from the window. That was it. At least, that's what I told myself. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the same person more often, usually at night. Sometimes they would be standing by the window. Sometimes they would be sitting in what looked like a chair facing outward. I never saw them clearly enough to know if it was a man or woman, but they were always there. The strange part was that they were never doing anything. No television, no phone, no obvious reason to just stand there in the dark. They would just sit or stand and look outside. I try not to let it bother me. I told myself that maybe they worked night shifts and had an unusual schedule. Maybe they were older. Maybe they were dealing with something personal. Everyone has their own life, and I didn't want to be the person who assumed someone was creepy just because they had different habits. So I ignored it. For a while it worked. I stopped checking the window. I stopped looking across the parking lot. I convinced myself that I was making something out of nothing. Then one morning, something happened that made me question whether I had been noticing the wrong things. I was leaving for work around 7:30 8:30 in the morning when I saw a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. At first, I assumed it was some advertisement or maybe a parking notice. I was already annoyed because I was running late, so I grabbed it and unfolded it while walking toward my car. It wasn't an advertisement. It was a handwritten note. There were only 5 words on it. Your curtains looked better open. I remember just standing there staring at it. I looked around the parking lot expecting to see someone. Nobody was there. The entire place was quiet. For a moment, I actually laughed because my brain immediately tried to find a normal explanation. Maybe someone had the wrong car. Maybe it was some weird joke. Maybe another tenant had mistaken my apartment for someone else's. But the longer I looked at the note, the less believable those explanations became. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. My curtains were usually closed at night. The only way someone would know whether my curtains were open or closed was if they were paying attention to my apartment. I ended up throwing the note away and going to work. I didn't tell anyone. I don't know why. I think part of me felt embarrassed. It sounds strange, but I didn't want to be the person who said, "I think my neighbor across the street is watching me," because even saying it out loud made it sound paranoid. The day went normally, and by the time I got home, I had mostly convinced myself that it was nothing, until I looked across the parking lot. The apartment window was dark, but the person was there, standing in the exact same spot. For some reason, seeing them after finding the note made everything feel different. Before, I was wondering if someone was watching me. Now I knew someone was paying attention. I immediately went inside and closed my blinds. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise in my apartment seemed louder than usual. The refrigerator turning on, the pipes making sounds, footsteps from people upstairs. I kept telling myself I was being unreasonable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew more about my routine than they should. The next morning, before leaving for work, I did something I had never done before. I looked across at the other building. The apartment window was open, and for the first time, I saw the person clearly. It was an older man, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s. He was standing there holding a coffee mug, and the moment I looked over, he smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a good morning neighbor kind of smile. It was more like he knew I had finally noticed him. I immediately looked away and walked to my car. I spent the entire drive to work thinking about that smile, because that was the part that bothered me the most. Not that he had been watching, not even that he knew about my curtains. It was the fact that he seemed completely comfortable doing it. Like he wasn't worried about being caught. Like he wanted me to know. And at the time, I still didn't realize that the note on my car wasn't the first thing he had left for me. It was just the first thing I noticed. After that morning, I started paying much more attention to my surroundings. I wish I could say I immediately confronted him or called someone, but the truth is I still wasn't completely convinced that something serious was happening. There was still a part of me that kept trying to explain everything away. Maybe he was just a strange person. Maybe he had no idea how uncomfortable he was making me feel. Maybe the note was some kind of misunderstanding. The problem was that every time I tried to convince myself it was nothing, something else would happen. A few days after I saw him smile at me from his window, I came home from work and noticed my apartment door looked slightly different. It was such a small thing that I almost ignored it. The door was closed, and everything looked normal. But I had a habit of pulling my door shut a certain way because the lock sometimes didn't catch unless I pushed it firmly. When I arrived that afternoon, the door was already locked, but the handle was turned slightly downward. I stood there for a few seconds wondering if I was imagining it. I checked my pockets. My keys were still there. Nothing looked damaged. There were no scratches around the lock. Nothing obvious that would suggest someone had forced their way inside. I unlocked the door and walked in. Everything seemed exactly how I left it. My laptop was on my desk. The dishes I hadn't washed were still in the sink. My jacket was hanging on the chair. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. That almost made it worse, because if someone had broken in and stolen something, at least I would have had an explanation. Instead, I was left standing in my apartment, wondering if I was becoming paranoid. I walked through every room, checking things carefully. The bedroom, the bathroom, the closet. Everything was normal. I eventually convinced myself that maybe I just hadn't closed the door properly when I left. It was possible. I was tired. I had been stressed. I wanted there to be a normal explanation. But that night, while I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My bedroom curtains were open. I always closed them before leaving for work. Always. My bedroom faced the same direction as the living room, meaning the apartment across from mine had a direct view inside if they were standing near their window. I remember just standing there looking at the curtains. I couldn't remember opening them. I couldn't remember touching them, but I knew I hadn't left them like that. I immediately closed them and stepped away from the window. For the first time, I seriously considered calling the police. But I stopped myself. What would I even say? Someone might be watching me through their window. I think my neighbor opened my curtains. Without proof, I knew exactly how it would sound. So instead, I did what a lot of people do when something feels wrong. I waited, and I watched. Over the next week, I started changing my routine. Not dramatically, just small things. I would leave for work at different times. I would take different routes home. I stopped sitting near my living room window at night. And every single time I made a change, I noticed something strange. The man across the street seemed to notice too. One night, I got home almost 2 hours later than usual. I had stopped at a store after work and grabbed some food. Normally, I would walk straight into my apartment, turn on the living room light, and start cooking. But that night, I sat in my car for a few minutes because I was on the phone. When I finally got out and walked toward my building, I looked across the parking lot. The man's apartment light was already on, and he was standing by the window. The thing that bothered me was that I hadn't turned my apartment lights on yet. There was nothing for him to see. I hadn't entered my apartment. I hadn't done anything, but he was already there, waiting. I went inside and immediately closed the blinds. A few minutes later, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was someone walking through the hallway, but then I realized the sound was coming from outside my apartment window. I slowly walked toward the blinds and looked through a small gap. The parking lot was empty. Nobody was there. I checked the window lock. It was still secure. I checked my front door. Locked. I stood there for several minutes trying to figure out what I had heard. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down, expecting a normal notification. Instead, it was a message request from an unknown number. The message only said, "Closing the curtains won't help." I remember feeling completely frozen, because at that point, there was no more pretending. Someone was watching me. Someone was trying to make sure I knew they were watching me. I immediately took screenshots of the message and called the apartment manager. The manager was an older woman who had worked there for years. I explained everything that had happened. The notes, the messages, the man across the street. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me a question I still think about. "Has he spoken to you yet?" I told her no. She sighed. Then she told me something I wish I had known when I first moved in. The man across the street had lived there for almost 10 years. His name was Daniel. According to her, he was mostly quiet and kept to himself. But over the years, there had been complaints. Nothing serious enough for police involvement. Just strange behavior. Neighbors had mentioned him watching people from his window, following people around the complex, showing up in places where he wasn't expected. The manager said she had spoken to him before, but every time someone complained, he claimed they were misunderstanding him. She told me that a few years earlier, another tenant moved out after feeling uncomfortable around him. At the time, everyone thought she was exaggerating, until she found out Daniel had somehow gotten copies of photos she had posted online. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't just some awkward neighbor. This was someone who had a pattern. Then I wasn't looking at the camera. I was just walking toward my car. On the back of the photo were 4 words. "I miss our talks." The strange thing was that I had never talked to him. Not once. I immediately called the police. This time, I didn't worry about sounding paranoid. I had evidence. The officers came and took the photograph. They also went across the street to speak with Daniel. I watched from my window as they knocked on his door. A few minutes later, Daniel opened it. I expected him to be angry. I expected him to deny everything. Instead, he seemed completely calm. The officers spoke with him for about 20 minutes. Then they came back to my apartment. They told me Daniel denied leaving anything. They said there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. The photograph wasn't enough. The messages couldn't be directly connected to him. The notes didn't have fingerprints. Basically, they believed me, but they couldn't do anything. I remember feeling completely defeated. Because even though they couldn't prove it was him, I knew. I knew because later that night, something happened that I still don't have an explanation for. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I don't know why. There wasn't a loud noise. There wasn't anything obvious. I just opened my eyes, and immediately I noticed something. My bedroom curtains were open. I sat there staring at them. I knew I had closed them before going to sleep. I always close them now. I slowly got out of bed and walked toward the window. I didn't want to look outside. I already knew what I would see, but I looked anyway. The apartment across from mine was dark. No lights, no movement, nothing. For a moment, I felt relieved. Then I noticed something on my windowsill. A small piece of paper. I still don't know how it got there. My window was locked. I lived on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing someone could stand on. But somehow, there was a note sitting on my windowsill. I didn't open it. I never found out what it said. I grabbed my phone, left the apartment, and stayed at a friend's house that night. The next morning, I started looking for somewhere else to live. I didn't care about the lease. I didn't care about losing money. I just wanted to leave. A few weeks later, I moved into another apartment across town. I never saw Daniel again. I heard from the manager months later that he eventually moved out. She didn't know where he went. She didn't know why. And honestly, I didn't want to know. The thing that still bothers me is that I never found out how much of it he was responsible for. Maybe he left every note. Maybe he sent every message. Maybe he was inside my apartment. Or maybe there was someone else involved. Because the one thing I still can't explain is how that final note ended up on my windowsill. To this day, I don't know if Daniel wanted to scare me, if he wanted attention, or if he genuinely believed we had some kind of relationship that never existed. But I learned something from that experience. The scariest people aren't always the ones who threaten you. Sometimes they're the ones who convince themselves they're doing nothing wrong. Because in their mind, they aren't watching you. They aren't following you. They aren't crossing boundaries. They're just being close to someone they think they know. And sometimes, that's what makes them the most dangerous. The first time I realized something was wrong with my neighbor, I was standing in my kitchen watching him wave at me from his backyard. The strange part wasn't that he waved. Neighbors do that. The strange part was that I had never introduced myself to him. I had never spoken to him. I didn't even know his name. But he stood there like we were old friends. At the time, I had only lived in that house for about 3 months. I had moved there after accepting a job in a different city, and honestly, I was excited about the change. The neighborhood seemed perfect. It was one of those quiet suburban areas where every house looked almost identical. Small front yards, neatly trimmed grass, driveways that could fit 2 cars, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. It wasn't the kind of place where people locked themselves inside all day, but it also wasn't the type of neighborhood where everyone was constantly in each other's business. That was exactly what I wanted. I was in my early 30s, living alone for the first time in years, and I liked the privacy. My house was at the end of a small street, and directly behind my backyard was another row of houses. The fences were tall enough that you couldn't easily see into someone's yard, but if you were standing in certain spots, you could see parts of the neighboring properties. The house behind mine belonged to a man who I guessed was probably in his 50s. I had noticed him a few times before, usually when I was outside mowing the lawn or taking the trash out. He always seemed friendly enough. He would sometimes be sitting on his porch drinking coffee or working on something in his garage. Nothing about him immediately stood out. The only thing I found slightly unusual was that he was always watching. Not in an obvious way, more like he was always aware of what was happening around him. At first, I actually considered that a good thing. Some people are just observant. Some people are naturally curious. I didn't think much of it. Then came the day he waved at me. I had just finished making dinner and stepped outside to take my trash bin to the side of my house. As I walked back, I noticed movement behind the fence. I looked over and saw him standing in his backyard. He smiled and lifted his hand. I smiled back. It would have been rude not to. Then he said something that caught me off guard. Finally got the garden looking better. I remember stopping for a second. I wasn't sure what he meant. I looked back at my backyard. I didn't have a garden. I had barely done anything outside since moving in. The yard looked almost exactly the same as it did when I bought the house. I laughed awkwardly and said something like, "Yeah, I'm still working on it." He nodded and went back inside. The interaction lasted maybe 10 seconds, but something about it bothered me. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Like he had been watching my yard for a while. Like he knew what it looked like before. I told myself I was overthinking it. A few days later, I met him properly. I was checking my mail when he walked over from his driveway. He introduced himself as Mark. He was polite, friendly, the type of person who seemed like he could have a conversation with anyone. He asked how I liked the neighborhood, asked about my job, asked where I moved from. Normal neighbor questions. But then he started mentioning things I hadn't told him. He knew I usually left for work around 8 in the morning. He knew I came home around 6. He knew I usually ordered takeout on Fridays. I remember laughing and asking how he knew that. He just shrugged. Pretty easy to notice when you live next door. That answer bothered me. But again, it wasn't enough to accuse someone of anything. Maybe he did just happen to notice. Maybe he spent a lot of time outside. Maybe I was being too suspicious. So I ignored it. For the next few weeks, everything seemed normal. Almost too normal. Mark would wave when he saw me. Sometimes he would make small comments about things around the neighborhood. He seemed like a harmless older guy who just liked talking. Then one night, something happened that changed the way I saw him. I was sitting on my couch watching TV when I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just a car driving by. But then I heard it again. A tapping sound. 3 quick taps. I looked toward my living room window. Nothing. I waited. A few seconds later, it happened again. 3 taps. This time, it sounded closer. I turned off the TV and walked toward the window. My first thought was that maybe someone was outside. Maybe a neighbor needed something. Maybe a kid had accidentally thrown something into my yard. I pulled the curtain back slightly. Nobody was there. The backyard was completely dark. I checked the front window. Nothing. I walked around the house. Still nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a branch or something hitting the window. I went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed something strange. There was a small rock sitting on my back porch. Not a normal rock. It was smooth and round, almost like someone had picked it out specifically. I stared at it for a while. I had no idea where it came from. My backyard was fenced. There wasn't an obvious way someone could have thrown it there. I picked it up and threw it away. Again, I told myself it was nothing. But then it happened again, and again. Every few days, I would find something strange in my backyard. A botla capitulu, a small piece of wood, a gardening glove. Nothing valuable, nothing that made sense. Just random objects. At first, I thought maybe they were blowing over from somewhere. But they always appeared near my back door. Always in the same area. The part that made me uncomfortable was that Mark never mentioned any of it. Even though he would sometimes talk to me about completely random things. One afternoon, while we were talking over the fence, he casually said, "You should probably lock your back door more often." I remember looking at him. I asked what he meant. He laughed, just saying, "You never know who's around." The comment itself wasn't threatening, but something about it felt wrong, because I had never told him whether I locked my doors or not, and he had no reason to know. That night, I checked every lock in the house. Front door, back door, windows, everything. I even started keeping a chair under the back door handle while I slept. I felt ridiculous doing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. A few days later, I came home from work and noticed my back gate was open. I knew I had closed it before leaving. I always closed it because my dog sometimes stayed outside while I was doing yard work, and I didn't want him getting out. I walked around the backyard, checking everything. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked damaged. But then I saw something near the fence. A footprint. Not mine. Not for my shoes. Someone had stepped into my yard. I stood there staring at it. And for the first time since moving in, I stopped trying to explain things away. Because the question wasn't whether something strange was happening anymore. The question was how long it had been happening. And I started wondering if Mark had been watching me long before I ever noticed him. After finding that footprint in my backyard, I spent the rest of the night trying to convince myself I was making it into something bigger than it was. That was becoming a pattern for me. Something strange would happen. I would feel that uncomfortable feeling in my stomach, and then I would immediately start searching for another explanation. Because the alternative was admitting that someone who lived right behind me might actually be entering my property. And that was a much harder thing to accept. I checked the footprint again the next morning before leaving for work. It was still there. I even took a picture of it with my phone. I didn't know exactly what I planned on doing with the photo, but something told me I should have proof of anything unusual that happened. That same day, I decided to stop talking to Mark. Not in an obvious way. I didn't want to create a situation where he knew I was suspicious. I just became less available. If he waved, I waved back. If he tried to start a conversation, I kept it short. But I noticed something almost immediately. He noticed. A few days after I started avoiding him, I came home from work and found him standing near the fence between our houses. He looked completely normal. Almost too normal. "Everything all right?" he asked. I remember feeling uncomfortable because I hadn't said anything that would suggest something was wrong. I just wasn't talking to him as much. I told him everything was fine. He stared at me for a few seconds before smiling. "Good. You seem different lately." That sentence bothered me. Not because it was threatening, because it confirmed something I had already started realizing. He paid attention to me. A lot. I gave him a quick excuse and went inside. That night, I made a decision. I was going to install a camera. I didn't want to confront him without knowing the truth. I needed something concrete. Something that wasn't just a feeling. So the next day, I bought a small outdoor security camera and installed it above my back door. It wasn't anything expensive, just something that could record movement. I tested it a few times and made sure it worked. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. And honestly, I started feeling better. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe the footprint was from someone working on another house. Maybe the strange objects in my yard were just coincidences. I wanted that to be true. Then, 3 nights later, I checked the camera footage before going to sleep. I don't even know why I checked it. Nothing had happened that day. There wasn't a reason. But I opened the app anyway. The first few hours showed nothing unusual. Then, around 2:30 in the morning, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was an animal. The video quality wasn't perfect, and the person was mostly hidden in the darkness. But after a few seconds, I realized exactly what I was seeing. Someone was standing in my backyard. I paused the video. I zoomed in, and I immediately felt sick. It was Mark. He wasn't near the fence. He wasn't looking for something that had blown into my yard. He was standing directly outside my back door, just standing there, for almost 4 minutes. The worst part wasn't even that he was there. It was what he did. He walked up to the door. He reached toward the handle, and he tried to open it. I remember staring at the screen, thinking there had to be some kind of mistake. But the footage continued. He tried the handle twice. Then he stepped back, looked directly at the camera, and smiled. The footage ended shortly after. I sat there for a long time without moving, because suddenly every strange thing over the last few months had a different meaning. The comments about my schedule, the objects in the yard, the open gate, the curtains, everything. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch with every light on in the house. The next morning, I called the police. When they arrived, I showed them the footage. The officer watched it several times. He asked me if I knew the person. I told him it was my neighbor. The officer's expression changed slightly when I said that. He asked me if Mark had ever been inside my house. I said no. Then he asked if Mark had ever done anything threatening. I explained everything. The notes, the comments, the things I found. The officer listened carefully, but told me something I didn't want to hear. Because Mark hadn't actually entered the house, and because nothing had been stolen or damaged, there wasn't much they could do immediately. They said they would speak with him. They also suggested I keep documenting everything. I remember feeling frustrated, because from my perspective, someone had been standing outside my back door in the middle of the night. Someone who knew my schedule. Someone who had been paying attention to me. But legally, it wasn't enough. Later that afternoon, the officer came back. He told me they had spoken with Mark. According to him, Mark admitted being in my backyard, but his explanation was strange. He claimed he was checking on me because he was worried. The officer asked why. Mark apparently told them that I seemed alone and that he had noticed I didn't have many visitors. That answer bothered me more than anything else. Because he wasn't a close friend. He wasn't family. He was my neighbor, and he had somehow convinced himself that monitoring me was normal. The police told him to stay away from my property. For a few weeks, things became quiet. Mark stopped talking to me. stopped waving, stopped appearing outside whenever I was outside. I thought maybe it was finally over. Then one morning, I woke up and noticed something strange. My back gate was open again. My first thought was that Mark had come back. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera footage. There was nothing, no movement, no person, nothing. But then I noticed something. The camera had been turned, not broken, not damaged, just rotated slightly upward. Someone had physically adjusted it. I immediately called the police again. This time, they took it more seriously. An officer came out and looked around the property. He checked the camera, the fence, the gate, everything. While he was walking around the backyard, he noticed something near the fence line. A small opening, not a hole exactly, more like a section where the fence had been loosened. The officer looked at me and asked if I knew about it. I told him no. Then he asked a question that made my stomach drop. Does your neighbor have access to your backyard from his property? I looked over at Mark's house, and that's when I realized something. The fence between our yards wasn't actually connected all the way. There was a small gap behind some bushes, a gap big enough for someone to squeeze through. The officer checked the area behind the bushes. A few minutes later, he found something. A small bag hidden underneath some leaves. Inside were random things. A lighter, some old receipts, a notebook, and several photographs. I still remember the feeling when the officer looked through those pictures, because his entire expression changed. The photographs were of me, not private photographs, not anything inappropriate, just pictures of me doing normal things. Walking my dog, getting into my car, carrying groceries, sitting outside, pictures taken from a distance. The officer asked if I knew how long Mark had been doing this. I didn't. Nobody knew. But then they found something else. A second notebook. This one was filled with dates and notes. My work schedule, the times I left, the times I came home, places I visited, small details about my life, things I had casually mentioned months earlier, things I never thought anyone would remember. The police arrested Mark that day. I later found out he had been charged with trespassing and stalking. During the investigation, they discovered he had done similar things before. Not exactly the same situation, but enough that there was a pattern. He would become interested in people around him. He would convince himself he was helping them. And when they pushed him away, he became angry. I moved out about a month later. I didn't want to stay in that house anymore. Every room reminded me that someone had been watching me while I thought I was alone. The hardest part was realizing how normal everything seemed. If Mark had acted obviously strange from the beginning, I would have noticed. If he had threatened me or behaved aggressively, I would have stayed away. But he didn't. He was polite. He smiled. He asked how my day was. He was just a neighbor everyone would describe as a nice guy. And that's what still bothers me. Because sometimes the people who make you uncomfortable aren't the ones who look dangerous. Sometimes they're the people who slowly convince you that everything is normal. And by the time you realize something is wrong, they've already learned more about you than they ever should have.